We are going to be talking about all of the amendments that ended suffrage in the United States.
Huh?
Wait, no, granted suffrage.
Oh, okay.
Wait, what does suffrage mean? Are you intrigued? I hope so. Suffrage actually means the right to vote, but you're not alone if you thought suffrage was a bad thing. It does sound like the word suffering. My goal this week is to ensure that none of my students ever end up signing a petition to end suffrage.
Huh?
Oh no, it happens on college campuses.
We're out here at Ohio State today trying to see how many people we can trick into signing a petition to take away a woman's right to vote and end women's suffrage. Would you like to help end women's suffrage? We're collecting names out here, writing a petition, send it to the university. Sure, all right, yeah. Show the university that we care about women, care about ending women's suffrage. Yeah, just sign your name, we're sending it to the university. Cool. Just trying to help end women's suffrage, repeal the 19th Amendment. Worried about all these women, our sisters out here suffraging. Don't want them to have to bear that burden. It's too much responsibility. Trying to repeal the 19th, baby, yeah, there you go.
God, stupid.
The 19th Amendment, you don't want that repealed?
No.
Should people be signing a petition calling for the repeal of the 19th Amendment?
Yes.
They should?
Mm-hmm.
What? Would you sign a petition to end women's suffrage?
Sure.
Definitely, yeah. We're out here trying to repeal the 19th, end women's suffrage. Worried about our female friends. Just trying to send a message to the university. Thank you. Women out here suffraging, trying to help them out. Just trying to make life easier, How do you feel about Donald Trump's plans to end women's suffrage?
That'd probably be a good thing, I guess, if it actually happens.
Yeah. What about his plans to repeal the 19th Amendment?
It could be good or bad. It could go either way. A lot of people have different opinions in every way. So I mean,
we're out here trying to help women. We're out here suffraging real hard. Definitely, yeah. Trying to repeal that 19th.
Sign a petition. Make sure you know what it means. And also, if you don't know what something means, it's okay to admit you don't know what something means. You're going to look awfully silly when you pretend to know what something means. All right, as I mentioned, we are covering the suffrage amendments this week, and it'll actually be the last week that I'm introducing new amendments. We've made it through almost all of them. And we actually already talked about one of the suffrage amendments. Do you remember which one it was? The 15th Amendment. I mentioned, though, that the 15th Amendment wasn't absolute, and it didn't just simply grant the right to vote to African-American males.
The 15th Amendment outlawed discrimination in voting rights. Contrary to popular belief, the 15th Amendment does not grant the right to vote to anyone. It simply outlaws discrimination in voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Congress failed to provide enforcement for the amendment originally. Enforcement did not come until 1870 with the passage of the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. Although formally ratified in February of 1870, African Americans were still denied the right to vote by a variety of means by Southern states. These included things like the poll tax and literacy test. It would not be until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the majority of African Americans in the South were allowed to register to vote.
Hopefully you remember learning a little bit about this last week. Let's move on to the 19th Amendment. It was ratified after nearly 100 years worth of work, 100 years that this guy's trying to undo. Fortunately, the Schuyler sisters had it covered.
So listen to my declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And when I meet Thomas Jefferson, I will compel him to include women in the sequel. Right!
Okay, maybe that's historically inaccurate. But can you blame me for trying to sneak another Hamilton clip in there? You have to remember, back then, women were treated a lot differently. They were not encouraged to have a professional career or to get a real education unless they wanted to be teachers until they became married. And after they became married, they didn't have the right to own their own property, keep their own wages, sign a contract, and they definitely did not have the right to vote.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. No, that's not the Declaration of Independence. It's actually from the Declaration of Sentiments, a document signed at the first ever Women's Rights Convention in 1848.
After the Seneca Falls Convention and the Declaration of Sentiments, it was clear that women had an uphill battle towards suffrage. The idea of voting rights for women was mocked in the press, and it was not supported politically. Suffragists and politicians did not give up. These interactive maps that you're looking at show women's suffrage campaign year by year and state by state from 1838 all the way up to 1919, as suffrage activists introduced legislation that often failed and at other times only gave partial voting rights. Also mentioned by me before is that nowadays we think that protests and people speaking out against the government is a new thing, but it's not. When President Woodrow Wilson was set to be inaugurated in 1913, the day before his inauguration, there was actually protests in the Capitol about this suffrage.
On March 3, 1913, protesters parted for the woman in white. Dressed in a flowing cape and sitting astride a white horse, the activist, Inez Milholland, was hard to miss. She was riding at the helm of the Women's Suffrage Parade, the first mass protest for a woman's right to vote on a national scale. After months of strategic planning and controversy, thousands of women gathered in Washington, D.C. Here, they called for a constitutional amendment granting them the right to vote. By 1913, women's rights activists had been campaigning for decades. As a disenfranchised group, women had no voice in the laws that affected their or anyone else's lives. However, they were struggling to secure broader support for political equality. They'd achieved no major victories since 1896, when Utah and Idaho enfranchised women. That brought the total number of states which recognized a woman's right to vote to 4. A new media-savvy spirit arrived in the form of Alice Paul. She was inspired by the British suffragettes, who went on hunger strikes and endured imprisonment in the early 1900s. Rather than conduct costly campaigns on a state-by-state basis, Paul sought the long-lasting impact of a constitutional amendment which would protect women's voting rights nationwide. As a member of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, Paul proposed a massive pageant to whip up support and rejuvenate the movement. Washington authorities initially rejected her plan and then tried to relegate the march to side streets. But Paul got those decisions overturned and confirmed a parade for the day before the presidential inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. This would maximize media coverage and grab the attention of the crowds who would be in town. However, in planning the parade, Paul mainly focused on appealing to white women from all backgrounds, including those who were racist. She actively discouraged African American activists and organizations from participating, and stated that those who did so should march in the back. But black women would not be made invisible in a national movement they helped shape. On the day of the march, Ida B. Wells Barnett, a groundbreaking investigative journalist and anti-lynching advocate, refused to move to the back and proudly marched under the Illinois banner. The co-founder of the NAACP, Mary Church Terrell, joined the parade with 22 founders of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, an organization created by female students from Howard University. In these ways and more, black women persevered despite deep hostility from white women in the movement, and at great political and physical risk. On the day of the parade, suffragists assembled to create a powerful exhibition. The surging sections of the procession included international suffragists, artists, performers, and business owners. Floats came in the form of golden chariots, an enormous Liberty Bell, and a map of enfranchised countries. On the steps of the Treasury Building, performers acted out the historical achievements of women to a live orchestra. The marchers carried on even as a mob blocked the route, hurling insults and spitting at women, tossing cigars, and physically assaulting participants. The police did not intervene, and in the end, over 100 women were hospitalized. Their mistreatment, widely reported throughout the country, catapulted the parade into the public eye and garnered suffragists greater sympathy. National newspapers lambasted the police, and congressional hearings investigated their actions during the parade. After the protest, the Women's Journal declared, "Washington has been disgraced. Equal suffrage has scored a great victory." In this way, the march initiated a surge of support for women's voting rights that endured in the coming years. Suffragists kept up steady pressure on their representatives, attended rallies, and petitioned the White House. Inez Milholland, the woman on the white horse, campaigned constantly throughout the United States, despite suffering from chronic health problems. She did not live to see her efforts come to fruition. In 1916, she collapsed while giving a suffrage speech and died soon after. According to popular reports, her last words were, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Though full voting inclusion would take decades, in 1920, Congress ratified the 19th Amendment, finally granting women the right to vote.
Page 29 if you're interested. The 19th Amendment reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. However, I must correct myself once again. The 19th Amendment wasn't the end all. Women of color and women in poverty were still being prevented from voting. I mentioned literacy tests last week as a way that some state governments were preventing people from voting. What I don't believe I went too into detail about was poll taxes. So, in order to vote, you had to pay a poll tax. You had to pay to vote. It actually took an amendment to make it illegal for federal elections to have a poll tax. And that brings us to the 24th Amendment, and one of my favorite cool ways to remember it. The 24th Amendment, you don't have to pay for voting. No more poll taxes. There are actually some who believe that the 24th Amendment is being violated with absentee ballots. When I mail in for my absentee ballot, I have to provide my own stamp to request it, and then they send it to me, and then I have to provide my own stamp to mail my ballot in. Or I have to provide my own paper and my own printer to print out my application, and then I have to mail that with my own stamp, and then use my own stamp to mail in my ballot. I'm paying to vote. And some argue that's a violation of the 24th Amendment. You may also hear of people who are against the requirement of a voter ID to vote because a voter ID costs money. And if I don't want to drive, do I really need an ID? So if I have to buy an ID, not a driver's license, I'm being forced to pay for an ID so I can vote. I'm being forced to pay to vote. And others say, well, come on, voter ID is to cut down on voter fraud. We have to know that it's you that's voting. And if you don't want to pay money for a stamp, then just go to the poll and vote. No matter where you stand on that debate, I bring it up because when I've been talking about these amendments throughout this school year, I always kind of like to give you an example of how you will need this in modern day life and how the 24th Amendment may come up. And back to this guy, I want to make sure if someone asks you your opinion on something, you have an educational background to form your opinion.
Just need your name? No? Thank you.
I do know what that word
Good,
means.
thank you. You don't want to help us end women's suffrage? Yeah, we're trying to end women's suffrage out here. Yeah. Do you guys want to help end women's suffrage? No, you don't. That's a good thing. How would you feel if people were out here signing a petition to end women's suffrage?
A little bit, I wouldn't feel too great about it.
Whoops. You give us a sign? All right, sweet, man. Thanks for helping. Really trying to support our women out here, ending women's suffrage. He took it.
All right, let's move on to the last amendment that we're going to cover this week and this year. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age in both state and federal elections to 18 years old. And fun fact, the 26th Amendment was ratified in the shortest amount of time of any of the 27 amendments to the Constitution. So the debate over lowering the voting age from 21 to 18 began in World War II, and then during the Vietnam War, when more and more young men were being drafted to fight, came the rally cry, we're old enough to fight, we're old enough to vote. Then, in 1970, in the Supreme Court case Oregon versus Mitchell, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress has the power to lower the voting age for federal elections, like for the president, but based on federalism, it's still up to the states to decide what their voting age would be for local and state elections. Because of this decision, if you were 18, 19, or 20, you could show up and vote for president and vice president, but you couldn't vote for state and local officials or state and local issues. On March 10th, 1971, unanimously, the Senate passed the resolution to lower the voting age to 18. It then went to the House, where it also passed 2 weeks later. Then, as I mentioned before, the quickest ratification in history, within 2 months, 3/4 of the states had voted to ratify the 26th Amendment. That youth vote has made a pretty big difference in a lot of elections. Some are even advocating to lower it to 16. What do you think? There are some areas that are experimenting with that, and there are cities throughout the nation that have lowered the voting age to 16 for local elections. I don't know about you, but all this talk about suffrage sure makes me want to vote.
Hey you, are you 18? Yeah, then that means you can vote.
And you totally should, because you're helping us shape the history of our nation.
That about wraps up this week's video. We have covered the 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments. A few weeks ago, I spoke with you about the 15th, and so that is the suffrage amendments for you. So you have this video this week. I also lumped together Hip Hugh's videos on the 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments. And then there will be a Google form. I did not provide an article link or a PowerPoint link this week. I'm hoping you paid enough attention in this video and his videos. But feel free to look back on some slideshows I've shared in the past or bring this video back up so that you can review some of the content I covered. There will be some questions in there about all of the suffrage amendments, the 15th included. Hopefully this week we're going to be here every day. Good luck on your ACTs. And that's all I have for you. Make it a great week.